Will one of you fight me? Israelites, you win, and the Philistines will be your slaves.
He used the Bible like a treasure map in his quest to find the tomb of King David.
The story of David and Goliath is the perfect underdog story, and everyone loves an underdog story. But it's also one of the most debated stories in the Bible. For decades, both skeptical scientists and believing theologians have dug deep into every aspect of the story in the quest to answer one major question.
He kills him with his own sword, to add insult to injury.
Is this story real? Today, we take you on a deep exposition as we explore both sides of the narrative.
I don't believe it. That's the skull of Goliath.
Who was Goliath? How did he die? And most importantly, what happened to his remains? This is the true story of Goliath. Epilogue. 1 Samuel chapter 17 verses 4-7. Then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was a giant of a man, measuring over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet, a 200-pound coat of mail, bronze leggings, and carried a bronze javelin several inches thick, tipped with a 25-pound iron spearhead, and his armor-bearer walked ahead of him with a huge shield. The story of David and Goliath has been told many times, and each time it inspires intrigue and fascination. It's the perfect underdog story. A giant and a little boy face to face on the battlefield, eyes locked and breath bated, each staring down with an intensity that will make you shudder. Their destinies were intertwined, and on that battlefield, both Goliath and David etched their names in the sands of time, never to be forgotten till the lights go out on the universe. But even though extensive exposition and several documentaries have been made about this story, the mystery continues to thicken, especially surrounding the personalities involved in the story and the question of if it ever happened at all. However, many of these expositions often focus on the victor David, who would go on to become the king of Israel. But very few look down on the slain man, the one who made the whole story so incredible. Very few people explore the life of Goliath and the several other giants who supposedly lived at the time. But as we dive deep into this story, we uncover secrets and unseen revelations about who the real Goliath was, how he died, how he lived, and where his remains were buried.
And war was at hand. The kings called forth their greatest fighters.
The birth of the Philistine giant. Giants have been around since time immemorial. The earliest account we have of giants in the Bible can be traced back to Genesis chapter 6 verses 1-4, where it expressly states that there were giants on the earth, born from the union of the sons of God and the daughters of men. These giants were said to have towered over the people, standing several feet taller than the average human at the time. Their history remained interwoven with the biblical narrative. Well after the Great Flood, however, an air of mystery surrounds their existence. For example, according to the biblical account in the book of Numbers chapter 13, verses 32-33, when the Israelites sent spies into Canaan to check out the territories, they found giants living in the land. Describing them as so huge, ordinary men looked like grasshoppers in their sights. These were known as the Nephilims, mighty giants who struck fear into the hearts of even the bravest warriors. Deuteronomy 3 verse 11 also spoke of another tribe of giants known as the Rephaim, most especially one named Og, king of Bashan, who slept in a bedstead of iron. 9 cubits was the length, and 4 cubits the breadth of it. To put that into perspective, a cubit is the distance from the elbow to the fingertip, which means this mythical king was also a giant, perhaps the last of the Rephaim. However, the most well-known giant in biblical history would be Goliath, the Gittite. He was described as a champion out of the camp of Philistines, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. But who exactly were the Philistines? According to biblical and historical texts, the Philistines were a tribe with roots that can be traced back to the Aegean. Around the 12th century BC, the Philistines settled in the southern coast of Palestine. This was also around the same time the Israelites appeared in the region. The first records of the Philistines in any ancient texts were the inscriptions and reliefs found in the mortuary temple of Ramses III, situated at Madinat Habu in Egypt. These inscriptions were said to have been inscribed towards the end of the Bronze Age, and they spoke of a tribe known as the Sea People. As the story goes, the Sea Peoples was an alliance of Western Anatolian states, who formed a coalition to invade Egypt around 1190 BC. This was after they had conquered many countries in the eastern Mediterranean, including Cyprus, Syria, and Anatolia. So, in the 8th year of the reign of King Ramses III, the Sea People launched an unprecedented attack on Egypt. engaging the pharaoh in a naval battle the likes of which the world has never seen. However, their offensives were heavily repulsed by the Egyptians, and they were eventually defeated. Following this humiliating defeat, the Sea People eventually settled on the coastal plain of Palestine from Joppa, which is now modern-day Tel Aviv-Yafo, just southwest of Gaza. At the time, the area was divided into 5 major Philistine cities. There was Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron, and together they became known as Philistia, or the land of the Philistines. As the Philistines settled into this newfound territory, they began exploring the possibility of an expansion. With their superior military might and capabilities, they expanded into the neighboring areas, taking cities by force and trampling upon the inhabitants of such conquered cities. This was when their paths crossed with the Israelites, as chronicled in the story of Samson. According to the accounts of Judges chapters 13 through to 16, the biblical Superman Samson fought valiantly to defend the people of Israel against the invading Philistines, until they eventually cooked up a plan to rid him of his power and take him out once and for all. Fast forward to around 1050 BC, and the Philistines had taken over part of the Judean hill country, even as they fought to further expand their territories. They were mighty men who were skilled in the art of war and terrorized everyone around them. But what was the secret of their military dominance? According to historians, it could be attributed to their monopoly on the iron smithing skill. 1 Samuel chapter 13 verse 19. Now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, "The Hebrews must not make swords or spears for themselves." So all the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen their plowshares, mattocks, axes, or sickles. As a means of preventing the Israelites from building up their military force, the Philistines made it a law that there shall be no blacksmiths among the Hebrews. This way, the Philistines were the only ones permitted to craft weapons and shields and armor out of iron, while the other territories under their control were only allowed to possess farming equipment. Even worse, these equipment could only be sharpened by the Philistines, so the Israelites had to travel to the territory just to sharpen their axes and sickles. Over the next couple of years, the Israelites and the Philistines engaged in several territorial clashes and border battles, and it was during one of those battles that the story of Goliath would emerge. The battle at the Valley of Elah. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soko in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim, between Soko and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the Valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. 1 Samuel 17 verses 1 to 3. It was around 1063 BC, and the stage was set for an epic battle between two conflicting territories. On one side there were the Philistines, gathered in a place known as Soko, and in Judah too. Their war camp was set up at Ephes Dammim, situated between Soko and Azekah. On the other side, there were the Israelites, who were assembled in the Valley of Elah, also known as the Valley of Terebinth, or Emek Halah. This valley stretches for about half a mile and is located southwest of modern-day Jerusalem. For 40 days, the two armies stood on opposing sides, and from the armies of the Philistine, a giant arose. His name was Goliath. He was a mountain of a man, standing at a staggering height of 6 cubits and a span. According to modern units of measurement, that's about 8 feet 5 inches and 10 feet 6 inches. He wasn't the only one though, as the Bible claims that he had brothers, but he was the most popular of them all. He was a giant and a champion of the army, who taunted the Israelites and their God, calling upon them to present a warrior from their end, who would engage him in a fierce battle. But for those 40 days, no one came out. That was until a young boy named David came on the scene. David had traveled from the fields where he tended his father Jesse's livestock to the Valley of Elah, where he was supposed to deliver food to his brothers, who were in the Israelite army. But on getting to the valley, David met this intimidating scene with Goliath slandering the God of Israel endlessly, and it lit a fire within him. So he asked one of the men standing around who this man was, and what reward would be given to anyone who could successfully bring him down. The other man informed him that Saul, the king of Israel, had promised that anyone who could successfully defeat the mighty Philistine giant would be rewarded with a lot of money. He would be given the king's daughter as a wife, and his family would be exempted from paying taxes in Israel. So he offered himself up as the sacrificial lamb who would fight and defeat the mighty giant Goliath. But on the other side, Goliath stood confident in his power and skills. His sheer size alone was enough to discourage any would-be hero from coming forward. so he was pretty sure the Israelites would never toss him a worthy opponent. Then, out of the corner of his eyes, he saw him approaching, a young boy dressed in shepherd's clothing. He saw a slingshot in the boy's hands, and he just couldn't contain his amusement and disdain. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" Goliath roared at David, but the young boy didn't seem bothered by the sheer size of the giant, or the thickness of his armor, or the fact that his shield alone was enough to decapitate him. So Goliath ran towards the defiant young boy, ready to crush him like a tiny little insect. But David didn't run away. Instead, he increased his pace, dashing for the battle line to meet him. He then reached into his bag, took out one of the smooth stones he had picked up from the stream earlier, aimed, and fired. The stone went straight into Goliath's forehead, and he fell face down to the ground, dead. At first, there was silence, as everyone couldn't believe their eyes, but David wasn't done. He then moved towards the slain giant and finished the business by chopping Goliath's head off with his own sword. After the Philistines saw that their hero had perished in battle, they ran. But they weren't fast enough, and the Israelites chased them to the entrance of the city of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. According to 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 52, their dead were strewn along the Sharaim road to Gath and Ekron. Finally, the Israelites were able to fight back against their enemies, and the victory was one of the most monumental events in the history of Israel. But how much of this is true? And what historical evidence can we find to support this biblical account? Many historians have studied this story for decades, and a couple of them have raised questions about the validity of the whole story. To separate fact from fiction, we will explore some of these contradictions and speculations one after the other, as we attempt to solve this puzzle one piece at a time. The David and Saul contradiction. One major issue a lot of historians have with this story is the fact that some of the details seem to contradict each other. This first one, for example, has cast a shadow on the whole narrative, and it's centered around the burning question of whether it was indeed David who conquered Goliath. According to many sources, there is evidence that the story was attributed to David after he became king, so as to promote his image as a fierce warrior. One major fuel for this theory is the fact that the account of David meeting Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 17, according to 1 Samuel chapter 17, when David started asking questions about Goliath and the rewards that would be given to anyone who defeated him, someone overheard him and went to report to Saul, the king of Israel at the time. Saul then sent for David, discouraging him that this mission he wanted to undertake was not for a little boy. But David would not be deterred, informing the king that he had faced fierce animals like bears and lions while tending his father's sheep, and that in the same way he conquered those animals, he would also see the end of Goliath, the giant. The issue here is that the story reads as though this was the first time Saul had met David or heard from him, but considering the accounts of 1 Samuel chapter 16, this seems to be a contradiction. You see, this previous chapter talks about how Saul mysteriously developed a mental illness, that only soothing music played by a specially skilled musician could calm him down, and that was the first time he would meet David. After searching through the land, King Saul's servants came in contact with this young boy who could play the lyre till the angels blushed. So they went to his father and asked permission to take David with them to the palace. And according to verse 23 of this chapter, Saul said to Jesse, David's dad, saying, "Let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight," which means that Saul had actually met David in the past. So why did it seem, in the very next chapter, that David and Saul were meeting for the first time? If David was already his armor bearer according to the previous chapter, why is he getting introduced to Saul again in the very next chapter? To further deepen the mystery, this part of the story is evidently absent from the ancient Greek translation of the Septuagint, or the Hebrew Bible. Samuel chapter 17 verses 12 to 31, which talks about David being sent to the battlefield by his father and meeting Saul, as well as the verse 55, where Saul seems to inquire about David's real identity, all are absent from the ancient Greek translation. Even the Dead Sea Scrolls don't help out in this case, as the parts that contain the Samuel manuscripts are fragmentary, having fallen prey to worms and the ravage of time. So with that vital part of the story missing from two important scripts, some serious questions were raised. However, that's not the only hole in this story. Where is Goliath's head? Another contradictory point of this story would be the mystery surrounding the location of Goliath's severed head. As we stated earlier, after David sent a stone straight into the giant's forehead, he then proceeded to behead him with his own sword. What happened next, though, is quite baffling. You see, according to the Hebrew and Greek translation of the story, David was said to have taken the head of the Philistine back to Jerusalem, but he put Goliath's armor in his tent. The first problem here is that, according to the story, David was that at the time this event took place, Jerusalem wasn't yet under the control of Israel at the time. It wasn't until decades later that David himself would talk about the capture of Jerusalem from a tribe known as the Jebusites. 2 Samuel chapter 5 verses 6 to 9 chronicles the conquest of Jerusalem by David and his army. Here's how it went. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." They thought, David cannot get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. On that day, David had said, "Anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. That is why they say, 'The blind and lame will not enter the palace.'" David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the City of David. He built up the area around it, from the terraces inward. From this story, it's safe to conclude that Jerusalem got into the hands of the Israelites after David became king. So, why did the Jebusites allow the young David to parade the head of the deceased Goliath on their land? Even more, why would David choose Jerusalem as a place to celebrate the victory of the children of Israel when the land wasn't theirs yet? But then again, that's not where the questions end. Who really killed Goliath? 1 Chronicles chapter 20 verse 5. In another battle with the Philistines, Elhanan son of Jair killed Lami, the brother of Goliath the Gittite, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod. Here we have another account of another Israelite conquering another giant also named Goliath. Or could it be the same Goliath? Although this is a pretty brief account that doesn't go into details, it's still worth mentioning because of the uncanny resemblance between the two stories. First, Goliath the Gittite means the same thing as Goliath of Gath, which was how the giant was described in 1 Samuel 17 verse 4. "And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath of Gath." The second issue is with an expression that was used to describe Goliath in both 1 Samuel and 2 Chronicles, and it goes something like this: Goliath, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. While the description of his massive spear could seem to be irrelevant information, it was worth mentioning, not once but twice. With such an uncanny similarity between the two stories, the question remains, who really killed Goliath, David or Elhanan? Or could there possibly have been another Goliath who was killed at a later time by Elhanan? The mystery continues to unfold. However, as we dig deeper into the story, we also uncover evidence that suggests that the David and Goliath story was actually a historical event, and not just a fictional story born from the imagination of an ancient storyteller like many claim. The missing link: Goliath's armor. The most crucial argument supporting the theory that David and Goliath actually happened is the biblical description of Goliath's armor, which seems to sit right at home with the archaeological discoveries from the era. Here's how it was described in the 1 Samuel 17 verses 5 and 6. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. According to archaeologists, this description fits the practice of the Bronze Age warriors, as well as the armor they wore to war. Back in those days, warriors like Goliath were known as champions, and they often marched in front of the ranks, leading the attack. They were called promachoi, which translates to first men, and their armor looked exactly the way Goliath's armor was described. Leg armor especially was used by Mycenaean warriors from the 13th century BC onward, and was even depicted on their pottery and art. These leg armors have also been found in several ancient tombs in Cyprus, which means the practice was widespread at the time. Before we go on with the rest of the video, here's our subscribers' pick for today. Recently, news broke that scientists finally opened the tomb of Goliath the giant that was sealed for thousands of years. As they peeped into this time capsule, they uncovered bones that looked human, but were so massive, scientists couldn't argue they belonged to giants. Strange as it may seem, bones like these have been springing up in several archaeological sites around the world. In places like Saudi Arabia, India, and even the United States, these bones have emerged, challenging the very essence of our historical narrative. But how true are these discoveries? With no public photograph to corroborate these claims, we can't help but wonder if these stories aren't just cooked up by ambitious explorers. What do you think? Let us know in the comments. Now let's get back to the video. Goliath and David in non-biblical texts. Another argument that has often plagued the story of David and Goliath is the fact that apart from the Bible, there are no other ancient texts corroborating the story. However, excavations have been going on at the site of Goliath's home city of Gath, producing evidence that suggests that the story was also documented by another author. These tales were found inscribed on pottery shards with ancient Semitic writings, and they contained names similar to Goliath. These broken pieces of pottery came to be known as the Goliath shards and have been dated to the 9th century BC. The fact that these inscriptions contain names that are similar to Goliath is sometimes quoted as evidence that the story indeed happened. But how about David? Well, there have been only 2 non-biblical inscriptions from the times of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah that contain the name of Israel's King David. Strangely, they all date to about 2 centuries after he lived. The first one is the Tel Dan stele, which was discovered around 1993 and 1994 during the excavations at Tel Dan in northern Israel. The inscriptions were written in Aramaic, and according to proven interpretations, it appears to be a proclamation of victory over Israel by Ahazel, who was the king of the ancient nation of Syria at the time. In one of the unbroken sections of this proclamation, he referred to Israel as the House of David, which confirms the fact that David was actually a real historical figure. Dated to between 870 and 750 BC, the inscription has been widely accepted as a reference to the biblical King David, who founded the House of David, and whose lineage continuously ruled over the southern kingdom of Judah until it was captured by the Babylonians in 586 or 587 BC. Then there's also the Mesha stele, another ancient text dated to around 840 BC. This one was supposedly made by King Mesha of Moab, which is now modern-day Jordan. In the inscription, there is the story of how the Moabites recovered their lands from the Israelites, and it generally matches the biblical narrative, which is contained in the book of 2 Kings chapter 3 verses 4 to 8. It also bears the earliest confirmed extra-biblical reference to the Israelite God Yahweh, and quite possibly the House of David. Unfortunately, one of these letters has become severely damaged, so the interpretation remains disputed. But the most notable archaeological evidence would be discovered at a site known as Kirbut Keyafa. This archaeological site used to be home to an ancient fortress city, which overlooked the valley of Elah, where the historical battle took place. Located about 20 miles southwest of Jerusalem and 7 miles from the ancient city of Gath, the ancestral home of Goliath, this valley is as crucial to the story as the personalities themselves. Since 2007, archaeologists Yosef Garfinkel of the Hebrew University and Sar Ganor from the Israel Antiquities Authority have led several excavations on the site, uncovering finds that confirm biblical stories. One of them was a potsherd uncovered in 2008, containing some of the oldest Semitic writings ever found in Israel. Now known as the Keyafa Ostracon, the potsherd contained 5 lines of writing that were fairly legible, along with some faded lines. While the interpretation may still be subject to debate, the generally accepted idea of the 5 lines sounds like this: Anak, you have cursed against the servant of God. The servant of God has judged you with the judgments of Yahu. Goliath, you are dead. David is master forever. I arise and we raise up the foundation of my kingdom. I raise up the people of my servant for his virtuous acts. For many people, it seems like a fantastic idea to have a non-biblical text mention the names of David and Saul side by side. However, it remains one of the non-biblical texts where 2 Bible characters are recorded in the same place the Bible recorded them, doing the same thing the Bible said they were doing, and at the time the Bible said it happened. Coincidence? We'll leave that for you to decide. Where was Goliath buried? After Goliath was killed on the battlefield, the Bible seems to grow a bit silent on what exactly happened to his remains. While that may be ascribed to the fact that he isn't the main character in the story, archaeologists have been poring all over the region where the events took place, in the search for Goliath's skeleton. Scientists finally opened the tomb of Goliath the giant that was sealed for thousands of years. Or did they? That depends on who you ask. But that question is not new. People have been asking the same ever since Bible times. For example, back in the Byzantine period, early Christians developed a tradition that Goliath was buried along a road leading up to Jerusalem. Antoninus Martyr, the 6th century AD pilgrim, provides an even more detailed explanation in his account. It reads, "As we were coming back to Jerusalem, and coming down on the road which goes to Gaza and Ashkelon, we kept on for 20 miles from Jerusalem, and we came to Mount Gilboa, where David slaughtered Goliath. There Saul and Jonathan died. There also Goliath rests in the middle of the road, a wooden heap at his head. He then describes a common practice of the day, where everyone was required to pick up 3 stones and throw them at the mound over Goliath's supposed burial site. However, this claim has been disputed many times. For one, the very accounts of Antoninus Martyr have been deemed inaccurate and exaggerated by some historians. With these flaws in his story, certain historians have deemed his account unreliable and untrustworthy. And this brings us back to the very question we started with: where is Goliath buried? There's also the theory that Goliath's head was actually buried on a hill called Golgotha, also known as the Place of the Skull. This hill, located just outside the walls of Jerusalem, was said to have been named as a reference to the fact that it is the burial site of Goliath's head. But other historical accounts claim that the place used to be an execution site, where several skulls were left unburied, hence the name. Golgotha gained even more significance in the whole story after Jesus Christ, the central figure of the Christian faith, was crucified on the same hill. As the plot thickens even further, we are left with many questions, most of which will only be demystified by time, as it unveils more revelations about this story that we've never seen before. Thank you for watching this video. See you in the next one.